Hello, America. Welcome to the third episode of the American Restraint podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Trepanier, and I'm excited to continue on this journey. Okay, before we get going, just a little recap for those of you who are new to the show. This is a podcast about how to fix America. It is largely based on my recent book, American Restraint, Taming Hyper-Individualism and Hyper-Capitalism. I believe the country is fundamentally divided and that the forces of hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism are largely to blame. I also believe in the power of federalism and shifting what DC can't do to individual states which can do. So last week, we talked about how all of the recent challenges facing our country are not just due to an uptick in divisiveness or a loss of trust. There is a structural reason why America has come undone. I promise to talk more about this structural reason why America has come undone in this episode. All right, let's go. The title of this episode is, What are hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism anyway? But first, a story. I used to be very patriotic, especially growing up in a military town like San Diego, California. But I wasn't naive about the mistakes America had made in the past, and I took pride in many of the great accomplishments of our country. America was the first country to abolish kings and aristocrats, and in so doing, elevate the common man. While the Declaration of Independence took quite a number of years to live up to the promise that all men are created equal, America during most of the 1800s and 1900s was a story that enabled life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for the vast majority of its citizens. Millions of immigrants came to America to have a chance at the American dream. Now, it is undeniable that millions of Africans and Native Americans suffered as most Americans' rights and freedoms expanded. However, Lincoln did lead America in eliminating slavery. America did help Europe win World War I. America did overcome fascism on 2 continents in World War II, and then rebuilt conquered Japan and Germany instead of destroying them. And it is undeniable that American capitalism has been the force for lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. However, over the last decade or so, my own personal faith in America has diminished as I have watched America come undone. The breakdowns in trust all across society, the breakdown of the family unit, declines in belief in God, increasing crime and decreasing effectiveness of our federal government. I have read a lot and listened to others who are concerned with America's decline. And, along with millions of fellow citizens, I became much more concerned about the direction of our country. As I listened to different opinions on what was ailing America and what could be done about it, I felt a sense of unease, because none of the authors and commentators' solutions seemed realistic. We discussed this a bit on an earlier episode. Simplistic solutions like, just elect better leaders, everyone just get along, or everybody stop being racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. I believe idealism is helpful to fix America, but I don't believe in utopia, at least not in this lifetime. I'm a realist with a strong dose of optimism. My own understanding of America's coming undone finally made sense as I came across Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed in 2018. So a little prop here. This is Patrick Deneen's book. Highly recommended. We're going to be talking a lot about this book on this episode. So I feel that this book best addresses America's current situation because he argues that the seeds for America's demise were sown long before its founding. So quick background on this book and the author. Patrick Deneen is a political philosopher at Notre Dame University. With a background in the history of political thought, Deneen's book was groundbreaking for its discovery of the structural reasons why America is so broken. I'll admit, I was a political science major in college, and so I geek out on political philosophy. And a quick caveat on the book title. When Deneen says liberalism, he isn't referring to liberalism in the sense of liberalism and conservatism today. He's referring to the entire political tradition that began during the Enlightenment and continues to this day. Some people call this classical liberalism. So Deneen's argument begins with the acknowledgement that the Enlightenment was initially wildly successful in replacing monarchies with democracies and in replacing feudalism with capitalism. He makes a compelling case that thinkers and political leaders from the Enlightenment like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Adam Smith helped liberate both individuals and economies. However, Deneen then argues that over a couple of centuries, because the Enlightenment was single-mindedly focused on the liberation of the individual, ultimately a society based on individual rights would relentlessly crush every family, community, and religious norm. One of the key parts of Deneen's argument is to be found in the evolution of the word liberty. Back when life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was included in the Declaration of Independence, the word liberty had a very specific meaning. But the word liberty has changed dramatically in the past 200 years. The Founding Fathers used the word liberty very deliberately. At that time, liberty meant freedom not only from despotic kings, but it also referred to a condition of self-discipline and an ability to rule oneself. In other words, restraint. However, if you ask the average American today what the word liberty means, they would probably say something along the lines of freedom to do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt someone else. This newer meaning is at the heart of today's hyper-individualism. You see, liberty today is less about freedom from despotic kings and self-control. It is much more about liberating oneself from any rule or custom that prevents self-fulfillment. I think a couple of quotes directly from Why Liberalism Failed are helpful to see how Deneen puts his argument together. So here's one. In explaining how attacks on tradition became ends unto themselves, the classical and Christian emphasis upon virtue and the cultivation of self-limitation and self-rule relied upon reinforcing norms and social structures arrayed extensively throughout political, social, religious, economic, and familial life. What were viewed as essential supports for a training in virtue, and hence preconditions in liberty, came to be viewed as sources of oppression, arbitrariness, and limitation. Here's a commentary on one of the high priests of mid-Enlightenment philosophy, John Stuart Mill, who wrote On Liberty in 1859. He was also the father of the do no harm principle. Do whatever you want, as long as you don't hurt anyone else. We now live in the world Mill proposed, said Deneen. Everywhere, at every moment, we are to engage in experiments in living. Society has been transformed along Mill's lines, in which especially those regarded as judgmental are to be special objects of scorn in the name of non-judgmentalism. A little bit of irony there, huh? So here's one last quote. In explaining how the Enlightenment ultimately failed in its lofty goals. Liberalism has failed because it succeeded, says Deneen. The political philosophy of liberalism was launched to foster greater equity, defend a pluralistic culture and belief, protect human dignity, and expand liberty. But it's done the opposite. It has generated massive income and asset inequality, enforced uniformity and homogeneity, fostered material and spiritual degradation, and undermined our freedom. So Patrick Deneen in Why Liberalism Failed argues that America's becoming undone was inevitable. And more importantly, we can't expect to simply erase Enlightenment's modern incarnation of libertarianism and easily restrain excessive individualism and excessive capitalism. So the arguments of Why Liberalism Failed succeeded in alienating both today's conservatives and liberals alike. Deneen indicts liberals and progressives over today's American culture, obsessed with freedom from sexual mores, family obligations, and community obligations. However, Deneen is just as merciless towards conservatives and libertarians and their infatuation with unrestrained markets, materialism, and profits over families and communities. Another interesting observation from Why Liberalism Failed is that Deneen lumps today's Democrats and Republicans in the same boat, because today's Democrats are obsessed with cultural libertarianism, and today's Republicans are equally obsessed with economic libertarianism. So we now live in a world of no limits, an America of hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism, an America where anything goes. So a quick aside here, another music note I like to bring into the podcast. I love the classics, especially Cole Porter, George Gershwin, and I think that the song Anything Goes, even though it was written in 1934, I think it perfectly describes the evolution of the Enlightenment from a focus on liberty and self-restraint to an obsession with libertinism and no restraints. So here's a few lines. In olden days, a glimpse of stalking was looked on as something shocking, but now, God knows, anything goes. Good authors, too, who once knew better words, now only use four-letter words, writing prose. Anything goes. The world has gone mad today, and good's bad today, and black's white today, and day's night today, and that gent today you gave a cent today once had several chateaus. Okay, so back to the analysis. One of the other really interesting outcomes of the book Why Liberalism Failed is that it helped propel a very public debate about the future of the Republican Party. A number of different movements within the right have splintered into different factions over the past decade. There are those in the establishment Republican Party, think maybe Senator Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, who are still trying to govern like Reagan in an America that has changed much in the past 4 decades. Those who criticize the old Republican establishment call it zombie Reaganism. Then, there are the common good conservatives, think Marco Rubio, who would like a conservative Republican Party that balances the needs of families and communities with the needs of both Main Street and Wall Street. Then there is MAGA Republicanism, which is honestly not as much of a political ideology as much as it is just Trumpism. The interesting thing about Trumpism is that it actually combines elements from both establishment republicanism and common good conservatism. I'm not really going to discuss the far right because they're really a small fringe movement that is much more obscure than the mostly Democratic mainstream media would have us believe. Probably about the same size as the far left, actually. So I think that Why Liberalism Failed is such an important book because it pointed out how behind the times both traditional Democrats and Republicans are. It pointed out how both parties let hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism destroy their parties. At least in the case of the Republican Party, it made it possible for a debate to take place, not only about the future of the Republican Party, but the future of America. It looks like after the major loss to Trump in 2024, the Democratic Party is having its own reckoning about its future, which I think that's very healthy. Upcoming episodes of this podcast will continue to examine the root causes of America's structural brokenness. America's broken because of both hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism. The solution to this brokenness lies in the power of restraint. The next two episodes specifically will dive into hyper-individualism and then hyper-capitalism, helping flesh out both of these ideas even more. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope everyone has a wonderful Easter week if you celebrate Easter. And if you don't, still have a great weekend, and I hope to see you next week. And just a reminder, here's the book, American Restraint, Taming Hyper-Individualism and Hyper-Capitalism. If you're interested and haven't read Why Liberalism Failed, highly, highly recommend it. That's a great book as well. But I think that my book, American Restraint, is a great companion book to Why Liberalism Failed, because Why Liberalism Failed is a solid diagnosis of what is ailing America, hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism. But my book adds not just the diagnosis, but also the solution. So that's it for today. Have a great day and a great week.